So now we take a look at what happens next after the Anglo-Saxons come and leave. Well, I say leave, because in 1066, one of the most famous years in British history, William the Conqueror comes from Normandy and takes over England. And suddenly he's at the top of the feudal system. And there's a whole load of new French nobles here. So they're all happy. And then who goes next? It's all his French knights who get land in return for fighting for the nobles who fight for the king, who also get land. And surprise, surprise, it's all the serfs at the bottom again, and they get nothing. They're forced to work on their manors, etc. So the king remains at almost absolute control, but the kings come from Normandy now, starting with William I. And some people didn't really like that. So, starting from 1066, there just happened to be a few rebellions. So there were rebellions in York and East Anglia, as well as elsewhere in the country, which meant that he had to take action. So he ordered extreme punishments for the rebels, and even just punished people who were not even directly involved. So farmlands were destroyed and animals were killed because people nearby rose up against him. So apparently up to 100,000 people may have died of starvation because of him. And not only that, William also came in and built a load of castles, such as at Dover, where with the stones being put together by peasant workers and for the Norman laws, and they allowed even further control and a strong royal presence and authority over England. But there are a few other new laws which help with that as well. So we've got the Law of Mirjam, which looks a bit like murder, and essentially it's basically a murder of a Norman person. So if a Norman noble or whoever got killed by an Anglo-Saxon, and then if the murderer wasn't captured and executed, because it was treason, then there's a special penalty known as a Mirjam fine, and that means that there's a large sum of money which would cripple an area, paid by the 100. So there's a fairly large area where the body was found, to create a sense that revenge wouldn't work out, and that any action against the Normans would result in such harsh punishment there's no point. And additionally, it would stop people from covering up. So if someone knew who did it, they wouldn't try and risk hiding it, because then they'd lose out as well. So William seemed to have a lot of control, and another thing he did was he created the new forest laws, or just designated lands as royal forests, which he could use for hunting. So one of the first ones he created was the New Forest, which still exists today, and around 40 village communities were evicted from the area to create a royal playground. And it meant that what had been land where people could grow crops and graze animals, so all of a sudden only the king was allowed to be there, or the king's permission holders, and created a new crime called poaching, which led to many bitten serfs who were previously using the land to provide a source of enough food for their family to eat. And it means that there's a new concept here of social crime, because unlike Mirjam, there was no community-wide punishment if, for example, if a deer went missing because they weren't too aware of what was actually there. So people didn't actually tell the normal authorities what actually happened, which meant that the king had to hire men to enforce the forest laws, and then people who were caught had to face really strict punishments such as hanging, which just created even more hatred from others. Okay, so also in the forest, some people, starting from earlier on in the Anglo-Saxon period, but some people ran away from trial and punishment. And if they were over 14 and a man, they were declared an outlaw, and a woman was declared to be waived, which meant that they were no longer protected by the law, which meant that someone could go in and kill them, which is their punishment in a sense for avoiding the course of justice. And it started tales of legend and myth, with most famous being even stories we hear nowadays of people like Robin Hood. And there were some gangs who had up to 50 outlaws and committed many serious crimes, such as the Folville gang. Okay, so if we look at the law enforcement and punishments, so there was still some continuity in the hue and cry method. If there was a crime, you'd shout out, try and yell at someone to go and help them. Especially with crimes which would result in major fines, such as the Mirjam fine, where the community would have to pay, so that people were actually willing to try and help. So the whole system of law was based on the ideas that men should expect to be safe from crime, and they could live peacefully and be around their homes, with the idea of the king's mund. So the king had to keep safety in a sense, but the king had to then have more authority in order to do it. So there were more strict punishments, such as death or mutilation, for more crimes, such as poaching, which previously basically didn't exist as a crime. And there was even a new system for their trials. As well as trial by ordeal, which did stay, there was the addition of trial by combat, where if there were larger sums of money over which were disputed, etc., then they'd get two people who would basically fight to the death for the rights to all the goods. Even though it might not be quite to the death if people came in, but the whole point was to have a more dignified way for the wealthier people. And there was still the requirement of the people being on the timing, etc. So an additional major difference was that these fines, which were previously going to the people who actually suffered them, the victims, but now these crimes went to the king, because guess what? The king wants more power and wants more money, and there's nothing there to really stop him.